because I see some, for me at least, some new faces, some old faces, and you're all warmly welcome. And we're very happy that you come here. The Yoani Foundation is a foundation founded in the beginning of the 90s, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and is working with party-affiliated democracy support with our basic values: freedom, democracy, and market economy. Working mainly with sister party support in many parts of the world, from South Caucasus, Eastern Europe, Balkans, Africa, but also a substantial lot of work in South and Latin America. And that's why we're very happy to have Yoani Suárez here that I will come back to very, very shortly. In the background here you see a website which will be introduced later today and found on the Yoani Foundation website, yoanifoundation.se, where it will be continuously updates about the ongoing situation and development in Cuba. But to give more information about the situation in Cuba and the region, we are very happy to have the International Secretary for the Cuban Democratic Directorate and well-known human rights defender, Yoani Sánchez here, and I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit more, so the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you. I'm welcome.
Thank you for having me. This is John Suárez. I'm the International Secretary of the Cuban Democratic Directorate. We're a nonprofit organization started by students originally in 1990, seeking to promote human rights inside of the island and provide assistance to the nonviolent opposition, humanitarian and otherwise. And we've also done a lot of work in the human rights field with the first the UN Human Rights Commission, then the UN Human Rights Council, and the OAS, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. Yesterday was an important day for me personally because it was the 10-year anniversary of the Black Cuban Spring. It also happened to be the year that I first went to the UN Human Rights Commission and dealt with this massive crackdown in which 75 human rights defenders were sentenced anywhere from up to 28 years in prison, and initially were being threatened with death sentences. At the same time, the 3 Cuban hijackers who were trying to flee to the United States were arrested, sentenced in a show trial to death, and executed within the space of 1 week. So we had that happening at the same time that they were threatening to also apply the death penalty to people who were organizing a petition drive called the Umbrella Project to call for human rights reforms in the Cuban legal system. The other item that I want to touch on, looking here at this page, the first 2 stories are very relevant. The second one, Castro's official violence against women, comes to mind because yesterday on March 18th in Palma Soriano, east of Cuba, in the province of Santiago, the ladies in white were meeting and having a literary tea when they were attacked by a mob organized by Cuban state security and political police at the home of Lady in White Dania Fernandez-Rey. And through tweets that were being sent from early this morning, Jose Daniel Ferrer Garcia, one of the activists who back in 2003 was being threatened with a death sentence for his activism, was tweeting as to what was happening to these women. One of the spokespersons of the Ladies in White was also present at the home, Belkis Cantillo. And this took place over a number of hours, beginning at 4:41 in the afternoon, and the last tweet we received was around 8:43 p.m., describing how communist brigades were beating and arresting 6 women for merely expressing outrage at what they were witnessing taking place against the Ladies in White. And some of these women were so badly beaten that they had to be hospitalized. State security then pressured the doctors to release them even though they weren't fully recovered. And as I said, this just happened yesterday. And it's part of a pattern that has been increasing over the last 4 years. With Raul Castro's arrival on the scene in Cuba, rather than things improving, they've gotten worse. And I'd like to show you some of the images of the women that have been impacted. This is this lady here who has the stitches that you can see see on top of her head, Marina Montes Piñon, the lady in white who was badly beaten with a blunt object in December of 2012. On the eve of International Women's Day, March 7th of this year, 2013, Iris Tamares Perez Aguilera was repeatedly assaulted and attacked again, hitting her in the head. She'd been attacked before in prior years to the point that she's actually developed a cyst that has not been attended to by medical doctors. I think you can, let me see if I can get this to increase the size, as you can see here. And she suffers from very serious headaches. It seems to be some sort of fluid there from the constant hits to the head. And it's another angle. This was, again, March 7th, March 8th. She was trying to get medical treatment, but Cuban state security was impeding and blocking it. The women are being attacked. There's also the case of Berenice, let's see if we can find the picture, a 15-year-old girl who was protesting someone bad-mouthing the ladies in white, and she was stabbed repeatedly with a razor blade and disfigured. And this was in November of 2012. So this is things that are happening right now. And why is it happening? For a number of years, beginning in 2003, things actually, for the opposition's best moment was in 2002. That's when they got 11,020 signatures for the Varela project. They delivered it to the National Assembly. Osvaldo Payá, Luis Iglesias, Yoani Sánchez of the Christian Liberation Movement went there, turned it in. Jimmy Carter went a short time later to Cuba at the University of Havana. He made reference to the Varela project, and millions of Cubans became aware of a citizen initiative for democratic change in Latin. The regime's response, a major crackdown, not allowing the petition drive to be accepted as it should have been under Cuban law to be debated before the National Assembly. Instead, they blocked that. They set up their own petition drive to declare the Cuban Constitution untouchable, which that passed very quickly. And then they had this March 18th crackdown in which the chief architects of this petition drive were arrested and sentenced to an excess of 28 years in prison. They thought at that moment that they had crushed the opposition. But what happened was the wives, mothers, and sisters who previously had not been opposition activists mobilized, and they founded the Ladies in White. And heading the Ladies in White was a very capable woman by the name of Rada Ollán. She also had other leaders within the movement, people like Berta Soler, who's currently the spokesperson. And they began to organize weekly marches, demonstrations, lobbying diplomats, trying to spread beyond Havana to other provinces, and forcing the regime to address the issue of these prisoners of conscience. And these 75 were all recognized by Amnesty International as prisoners of conscience. That was taking place inside of Cuba. Outside of Cuba, a very good friend of a couple of very good friends of the Cuban cause set up an International Committee for Democracy in Cuba. It was first proposed early in 2003, a couple of months after the crackdown by Václav Havel. And pretty soon you had a committee of former heads of state, people like Václav Havel, José María Aznar, Prime Minister of Spain, Mark Lahr of Estonia was part of this committee, and they set up a permanent committee to focus in on obtaining the release of these political prisoners and promoting democracy and human rights in Cuba. And they were having events in different parts of the world for a number of years. So what happened? They succeeded. The 75, thanks to this pressure from the women and opposition activists inside, the diplomats outside, the heads of state, members of parliament, signing petitions, pressuring the Cuban government. By 2010, coinciding with the death of one of the activists, Orlando Zapata Tamayo, who died in a hunger strike when he was being denied water for approximately 18 days, these activists again, generated another round of demonstrations inside the greater outrage internationally, and put enough pressure on the dictatorship that they felt obligated to release these prisoners. Now, rather than sitting down with the Ladies in White, who had been the primary force inside of the island to obtain this release, they decided to work with an institution that was already recognized as independent, which was the Catholic Church. So instead of the Catholic Church serving as a mediator between the opposition and the government, the regime basically accepted the Catholic Church as the opposition representative to sit down and negotiate the terms of release for these prisoners. And then left the cardinal in the unenviable task of calling the families of the political prisoners and the political prisoners themselves and asking them if they would go into exile or not, even though it wasn't clear that they had to be released, but it wasn't clear that they would be released if they didn't go to Spain. This process ended by March of 2011, and then we saw a decrease in international attention towards Cuba because the prisoners were out. Raul Castro was trying to generate the image of some type of cosmetic changes, which in reality were not true changes. And Osvaldo Payá described it as fraudulent change. But the international community was no longer as focused in Cuba. So what we saw happening after the death of Orlando Zapata and the release of these prisoners, other opposition activists dying under suspicious circumstances. Juan Wilfredo Soto Garcia in May of 2011, beaten by state security agents at a park and died 3 days later of a pancreatitis, most likely product of the attack. Wilman Villar Mendoza, another prisoner, Amnesty International prisoner of conscience, who died on hunger strike in January of 2012. And then we saw, since it wasn't a reaction to those deaths, we saw an escalation with Lara Boyan Toledo. After her husband was released, and the ladies in white said they would continue their work to see that all of Cuba's political prisoners were released, and that they were now a human rights movement. Within the space of weeks, she became ill and died. And she died within the space of 7 days. Now, you must recall that these women, while they were marching and protesting, were also being injected with needles, that nobody really knows what were in those needles. Secondly, once she got to the hospital, Oscar Leas Becerra, a dissident doctor, described what she was subjected to as purposeful medical neglect. So that was October 14th of 2011. Again, Wilman Villar Mendoza dies in January of 2012, and there's not a big reaction from the international community about this. The opposition people inside Cuba are outraged, they're marching, they're protesting, they're suffering greater escalations of violence against these activists. And then the Pope visit. Pope Benedict XVI arrives in Cuba, and the regime succeeds in shutting down all the cell phones of the opposition and rounding up many of the opposition activists. One of them, Sonia Gacro, today was, I think it's her 1-year anniversary in prison along with her husband, a lady in white, who had been beaten beforehand as well by state security. Then we see July 22nd, Osvaldo Payá Sardinas, who just a few weeks prior, they tried to throw a car against he and his wife in Havana, and his vehicle was knocked over on its side, and if not, by the grace of God, he could have been killed then, but he and his wife. And a couple weeks later, on July 22nd, traveling from Havana to Bayamo with Aaron Molig from Sweden and with Angel Capomero from Spain, they were being followed, and this we know because there were tweets from the government, the pro-regime Twitter, saying that Bayá was on the road in the morning, and then later from the testimony of Angel Capomero, who appeared in an interview in the Washington Post and spoke with Rosa Maria Bayá, that they were being followed by different vehicles, beginning in Havana, all the way to Bayamo, and finally there was a red Lada that crashed into their car, forced them off the road, and then you have this Spanish citizen, Swedish citizen, held in custody under the tender mercies of the Cuban intelligence service, an intelligence service that was trained and formed by the East German Stasi. And there's been some sort of bilateral agreement between the Spanish government and the Cuban government in terms of getting Angel Capomero out, where the Spanish government has recognized the show trial that was performed against Mr. Capomero, and he's still serving out his sentence in Spain. The Payá family views this as an outrage, and they're demanding an international investigation into what actually happened. And this past week, I was in Geneva with Rosa Maria Payá when she spoke before the UN Human Rights Council, in which the Cuban regime accused her of being a mercenary and tried to censor her presentation, along with China, Pakistan, Belarus, and other gross human rights violators who came to the defense of the dictatorship in Cuba. And I want to play for you a moment her presentation, and also you can see the interventions by these various countries. An interesting side note. Osvaldo Payá, when the U.S. Began to send Al-Qaeda prisoners to Guantanamo Naval Base, the Castro regime initially was offering to offer assistance if any of those prisoners escaped to return them to the base. The first person who criticized sending those prisoners to Guantanamo was Osvaldo Payá, who said that even if they were terrorists, they were still human beings and had certain fundamental human rights, and that it was unacceptable to be sending them to Cuban territory. So he was definitely someone who was an independent thinker with an independent voice, and the same can be said of the movement that he still left after his passing. I also want to talk about one of the things that was brought up here, and I'll conclude and go to questions and answers, is that about these changes that they've been discussing. The reality is that they announce things and then they don't follow through. In 2009, the first time that Cuba underwent its Universal Periodic Review, in the days leading up to it, the Foreign Minister and the Minister of Justice both announced that the Special Rapporteur on Torture would be granted an invitation to Cuba. They repeated it 2 or 3 times, were very public about it, but never followed through. The Special Rapporteur at the time, Manfred Noack, held a press conference about a year and a half later at the Human Rights Council and was extremely critical about the lack of follow-through because the promises that were being made led him to concentrate on Cuba rather than make other visits that he could have done at that same period of time. Secondly, international media talked about how right now there's a lot of talk about the issue of travel, that a new law was passed and that there's reform. The problem is, what's happened is they've replaced one set of controls with another. Beforehand, you had to have your passport and then you had to request a white card to obtain permission to be able to leave the island. And that white card would be, you'd be subject to all sorts of restrictions based on political content, based on what profession you practice. Now, they've gotten rid of the white card, but those same restrictions are present for obtaining the passport. And Rosa Maria Payá has spoken on more than one occasion how in December of this past year, she had all the items necessary to be able to travel outside of Cuba, but the official told her, you can't travel, and we'll let you know when you're allowed to travel. Earlier this year, in February, she just went to the airport, tried to get on the plane to see what would happen, and she was able to get out this time. Will they allow her to return? Will they allow her to travel again outside the next time? There are no guarantees, because these reforms are not based on rights. They're not really reforms. They're basically cosmetic to try to sell an image internationally, to try to increase the legitimacy of the regime. Another example of this was that there was news late last year, the BBC News reported that Cuba's ban on anti-Castro musicians, people like Celia Cruz, was being quietly lifted. And others soon followed in reporting the news. The story specifically mentioned Celia Cruz as one of the artists whose music would return to Cuban radio. Yet, on August 21st, less than 3 weeks later, Tony Pinelli, a well-known musician and radio producer in Cuba, distributed an email which Rolando Alvarez, the national director of the Cuban Institute of Radio and Television, confirmed that the music of the late Celia Cruz would continue to be banned. The email clearly stated, quote, all those who had allied with the enemy, who acted against our families like Celia Cruz, who went to sing at the Guantanamo base, the ICRT arrogated to itself the right quite properly not to disseminate them on Cuban radio. Was this reported widely in the news? No. The initial announcement that was very positive but not factually true, you can find everywhere. This later announcement you can only find reference in the Diario de Cuba. And that's the problem. They're getting away with generating this false, fraudulent image of reform, while at the same time, the human rights situation is deteriorating, and people are dying, and people's lives are being threatened, like Rosa Maria Payá. So I thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Thank introduction and also showing us this movie, which I think gives us the view that this regime is as ridiculous little as many other undemocratic regimes. I will open up the floor for questions and answers, and I will start with one myself first, because the region has been quite much in the focus the last weeks after Hugo Chavez passed away. We also spent quite some time in Cuba, and also been very supportive economically in Cuba, and the relation between the regimes have been very much ongoing. What do you see could be the impact of the development in Venezuela in the way of Hugo Chavez for the development in Cuba and the rest of the region?
The same question. I have another. Yo tengo otra pregunta.
Well, I'd like to first provide a little context to this question. On February 2nd of 2010, Hugo Chavez invited into the ranks of his regime a gentleman by the name of Ramiro Valdez. Ramiro Valdez was one of the historic commanders of the Cuban Revolution. Afro-Cuban scholar Carlos Moore, a man of the left, offered the following observation on Commander Valdez back in 1961 and today. He stated, Ramiro Valdez was an inflexible, totalitarian, and brutal person. He was the most feared man in Cuba. The repressive policies of the regime were crafted by him. Valdez struck fear into the hearts of Cubans, even revolutionary ones. Today, he apparently continues to be the same dogmatic, sectarian, and brutal person who was at the height of his power. His revolutionary compatriots in the late 50s, early 60s, the nickname they had for him was Charco de Sangre, which translates into English as pool of blood. And those were his friends who were calling him that, to give an indication. This is the man that goes to Venezuela ostensibly to help with electrical power outages in the country, even though he doesn't have a background in electronics or electrical engineering. But he is a person who knows how to build a totalitarian society. He's 79 years old today, but in much better health than either Raul or Fidel Castro. And he's been moving back and forth between Venezuela and Cuba. And as you know, Chavez's security services, his guards, were primarily Cubans. And the Cubans have also penetrated the military. And the Venezuelan national ID that has GPS is manufactured by Cubans. So the Cubans are very much on the ground in Venezuela. And as you know, Chavez spent his last days in Cuba. And Fidel Castro was very closely monitoring what was taking place and making comments. Another item which is interesting is according to the Venezuelan Constitution, Diosdado Cabello, the National Assembly Speaker, was the one who was supposed to be assuming interim power before convoking elections. Instead, they go with Mr. Maduro, who is someone that is viewed as more of a confidant of the Cubans. I don't know what's going to happen, frankly. They are hermetically sealing what the process is going to be in terms of between the Cubans and the Chavistas. But I'm not optimistic. I noticed that Capriles came out saying that he will be cutting off the subsidies to the oil subsidies to Cuba because it's not in the interest of the Venezuelans because they're not getting money's worth. And that tells you what side he's on and what problems that will create for the Cuban government. And they will do everything within their power to make sure that Maduro is elected, and then we'll see what happens. But if, by any chance, yes, if Venezuela does change, yes, it would impact the Castro regime greatly as it would many countries in the region. But I'm not terribly optimistic at the moment.
So, Alexandra.
Okej, jag ska köra på svenska, alltså det är enklare. Men you can answer in English, no problem. Era más o menos igual la pregunta que él te hizo, pero ¿cómo se va a definir la situación? ¿Va a seguir colaborando con Ecuador, con Nicaragua, o va a haber algún cambio positivo en la actualidad, a raíz de la muerte de Chávez, va a haber algún cambio positivo o negativo en la situación cubana. Det är så här alltså, hur det ska påverka alltså hela situationen i Kuba efter Chávez dog och hur det ska ha hur kan man ska utvecklas vidare det förhållande mellan Nicaragua och Ecuador med Kuba förhållande.
I think that's going to depend more so on, I believe that's going to depend more so on the death of Fidel Castro. I believe that the idea of projecting oneself at the level of the hemisphere with this revolutionary project is a vision that Fidel Castro had since the Sierra Maestra in 1959. And I think he had a dramatic impact on Chavez and the policies pursued by the Chavistas. And the fact that Maduro is viewed as their man would indicate to me that they'll probably try to continue those policies to expand their influence in the region and be financed in different revolutionary movements. In the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, they tried doing this through armed guerrilla struggle. That was a disaster with the exception of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And they went as far afield as places like Africa and Ethiopia in these adventures. So I don't see any reason why they would stop. At least while Fidel Castro has any sort of input. If he becomes ill and finally leaves the scene completely, then I think there could be more likely to see a change in that direction and have more of a pragmatic approach.
Thank you. Margareta Silverfelt.
Thank you. Thank you, Krista. Thank you for a very interesting introduction. I have a question, and that's about the situation in the region. Now there have been the death of one leader, but of course Castro is quite old, and there are other leaders that's also old. What do you think about the situation? Can you see that it's possible to be a change in the political area when Castro died?
Well, first I think that, unfortunately, the regime has studied very closely what took place in Eastern Europe. They were also looking undoubtedly at the Arab Spring and different models. And I think that's one of the reasons you see people like Osvaldo Payá Sardinhas and a lot of Guyana especially being targeted and dying under suspicious circumstances. I think that the person who most likely have overseen a transition in Cuba to democracy and had the unified support of pretty much all the sectors of the opposition, a lot of international specters, a lot of Guyana. Secondarily to that then would be Osvaldo Payá Sardinhas, although he had certain areas of the opposition that weren't too crazy about him. But he's somebody that in a transition scenario would definitely be a key player. But the person who was the most profound threat to the regime was the first person to be taken out of these high-profile opposition because that was a lot of Guyana to live. Now, there are other figures. Laura Guyana being a very good leader, left leaders within her movement. One of them is now traveling through Western Europe at Desoled. Last I saw her was in Warsaw. I hope she'll come here to Sweden so you can speak with her. They do have leadership capability. They can be an alternative in power to the dictatorship, and because of that, they're being targeted. Their lives are under threat. The ability to determine that if there's going to be change with the death of Fidel Castro will be determined by whether or not the international community pays attention and provides the visibility and protection to these opposition activists so they can be around in a post-Castro transition and not join the ranks of Laura Guyana and Osvaldo Payá's martyrs of Cuban freedom.
And the next person to ask a question is Margareta.
Thank you. Well, I was going to the same area. What will happen, or what are the things that had happened when Castro died? Was he will certainly do it further later. But if you add on to that question, what do you consider how do you consider the process will be after Castro's passed away? But also, what can we in the Western world today do in order to enforce your struggle for freedom? Because when you listen to your story, it's a fair for listening, and it's nothing we would like to see anywhere else. But what can we actually do in order to support it today?
It's something that's very simple but very difficult at the same time, especially in politics. Maintain a principled policy that respects and advances human rights. Unfortunately, in this world, there are also economic and business interests, and we've been witnessing now with Spain what's been taking place with the case of Osvaldo Sardinias. And I'll be very blunt. The centrist Democratic International did not want Regis Iglesias or Rosa Maria Payá to speak for that NGO. When we requested to put them on the list of credentialed speakers, even though Osvaldo Payá was the vice president of that international, and his wife is today not the vice president, they literally initially said no, they wouldn't accept it. Then later when they did, they tried to invalidate the list once they were there in Geneva. Now, since we had a sense that things would go badly, we had already credentialed them with a second NGO through which they were able to speak. But it's very troubling. It's very troubling when a Spanish national citizen who, by all appearances, has been a victim of the Cuban state security apparatus, who was subjected to a show trial where there is no independent judiciary, as is the case in Cuba, and for the Spanish government to accept the results of that trial, and that Spanish citizen completed a prison sentence imposed by the totalitarian regime is extremely troubling. Furthermore, when when members of parliament raise the question, and members of the Spanish Foreign Ministry say that they're endangering other Spanish lives by asking those questions, which begs the question, are you being blackmailed? Do you have other Spanish citizens that are hostages, and for that reason you have to be taking on the policies? Those are very difficult and complicated questions that become more complicated when you also add the business interests that are there from Spain. The fact that after us last presidency, or during us last presidency, they nationalized the Spanish Cultural Center in Havana, which is an implicit threat to all the business interests that are there from Spain, that they could also be nationalized. So it's a serious amount of money. In that respect, it's also potentially endangering. But to get back to the initial question, a principled policy to defense human rights, a European common position that is not watered down, a European common position that, as was the case with Zimbabwe when that was a bit stronger, where those who are engaged in these type of attacks against innocent women, engaging in extrajudicial executions, are not permitted to travel to Europe, whose bank accounts are frozen. That sends a message. It breaks the veil of impunity that makes these people believe that they can do anything they want. And that's what we need from the West if the opposition is going to be able to survive these next few years, which will be very difficult inside the island.
Thank you very much. And now the question goes to Herman Diaz.
Herman Diaz.
Yes, so please.
Yoani Sánchez, jag ska prata på spanska sen hon ska tolka. Yoani Sánchez, en su visita a la Facultad de Periodismo de la Universidad de Columbia el pasado 14 de marzo, ha afirmado que en Cuba han tenido lugar reformas que ella misma ha bautizado como raulistas.
Okej, när Yoani Sánchez, Yoani Sánchez. Okej. När Yoani Sánchez besökte journalistfakultet, hon påstod att det skulle finnas alltså olika reformer som skulle döpas som raulistas.
Och mi pregunta es, ante esta situación, ¿no será necesario un cambio de estrategia de parte de la oposición en la isla y de los cubanos en el extranjero que signifique una ayuda al cambio hacia la democracia? ¿Y cómo propondría usted estas nuevas estrategias? Y quizás tenga algunos ejemplos concretos.
Bueno, det undrar jag, och det fanns möjligheter om eventuellt man kunde ändra alltså olika strategier till alla kubanska befolkning som bor utomlands. Och då det är en fråga till dig, vad tror du alltså hur du kan påverkas och angående det här ändringar som kan ske?
Well, first let me say about the issue of strategy, and then I'll ask you the question in terms of I think that the opposition in Cuba and outside of Cuba has a consensus in a global strategy of strategic nonviolence, nonviolent resistance for democratic change, speaking truth to power. And I don't think that that's something that one can debate whether you view Raul's initiatives as authentic reforms or not, and we can have a discussion and debate about it. I'd love to see what your perspective is, because I'd have to go back and read what Yoani Sánchez had to say specifically. If you just tell me, well, it's Raul's reforms, well, which reforms are we talking about? On the issue of travel, I have serious reservations about what's being described as a reform. If I look back over the last 30, 40 years, this is a regime that at different times, Osvaldo Payá was able to travel to Strasbourg to receive the Sakharov Prize and return to Cuba. Then he wasn't able to go again because they arbitrarily restricted him. And the way the laws are set up today, the same thing can happen again. They may have this opening now for members of the opposition to be able to travel, but then when it's not convenient for the interest of the regime, they close that space up. They've done it time and time again with different elements. The economy. In the 80s, they had the farmers markets that they opened up. The farmers became too wealthy, but it put them over the hump of the crisis they were suffering at the time. Then they closed up that part of the economy again. In the 90s, they dollarized the economy, and they set up cuentapropistas, the sole proprietorships, very broadly. And then as the economy improved because of foreign investment from Europe, China, and elsewhere, they again tightened up those spaces that they had created. Now, whatever reason, they seem to be in this process of doing certain key tactical openings. But based on the last 40 years of history, to me that just seems to be a tactic to perpetuate the regime, not to have any sort of serious reform. Just a question of how to survive with tactical changes short term to perpetuate the Castro brothers' governance. But I'm curious, I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. I mean, what do you mean by the Raulista reforms?
Lo que Yoani quiso decir en aquella ocasión, que han habido reformas. Bueno, eso que tú dijiste, que el pasaporte, que ha dado la posibilidad de viajar, entre otras cosas, que no han sido reformas.
Pero ella también ha sido dudosa cuando ella habla de viaje. Ella ha sido ambivalent. She's been somewhat ambivalent, even on that.
Ya, pero ella habla de que han habido reformas, pero que no han sido, ¿cómo decir la palabra? Profundas.
So she's saying that they've been superficial reforms. So the debate is one between cosmetic and superficial. I think right there is just an issue perhaps of definition.
Claro, no. Y entonces ella dice que las reformas han sido, que no es que Castro permita las reformas, sino que han sido por las presiones que tanto desde el exterior como desde el interior se han logrado, ¿no?
Oh, so she's, I can say, he's saying that what she's saying is that due to the pressures externally, internally, that she's saying that that's why these cosmetic or superficial reforms have taken place. I call them cosmetic, she calls them superficial.
Pero bueno,
it's a one half dozen of another.
Ella habló también de una cosa muy importante, de un derecho que se ha estado exigiendo durante muchos años, que era el derecho de viajar sin el permiso de salida, y que bueno, que esto ha sido un logro, una reforma que se puede palpar.
It is true that they've gotten rid of the white card, but then the question is, when you look at the law and the Gazette, the restrictions that were involved with the white card have been transplanted to the passport in terms of the professions and also the issue of political content, and it's run through the Ministry of the Interior. So it's sort of, yes, they've gotten rid of the white card, but yet there's still those political controls in place.
Right. Indeed.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you, sir. I have two questions. One is, do you call the regime monolithic, or are there different power structures that might create an opening for change? And the second one, how do you look upon the Latino Pope? Do you think anything will happen with the Catholic Church's engagement in
Undoubtedly, the regime objectively is not monolithic, but for the sake of the survival of the officials that may have a different thinking, they have to appear as being part of the model. There were people that many thought were very hardline supporters of the regime, like Felipe Pérez-Roque, Carlos Laje, who for many years, especially Roque, was sort of like a bulldog for Fidel Castro. And a Spaniard who was had a meeting with him at his home, getting him to speak candidly, tape recorded him, and state security got a hold of the tape recording. These gentlemen were very dismissive of Raul Fidel Castro, referring to them as the old men in Pampers and wishing their speedy departure from this world so they could get on with change in Cuba. Now, does that make them reformers? I don't know. In their practice and their behavior, they were not. In their thinking, they were obviously not loyalists to the regime, but in their practice and their patterns and behavior, there was nothing to indicate otherwise, because if that was the case, it would have been purged even sooner. So it's a safe bet that there are people there that would like to have other options, but the question is for them to exercise that, what needs to be going on. And I would argue that rather than trying to cherry pick those in the dictatorship, you support the people out in the streets that are openly, transparently, and non-violently defying the regime. And as those ranks grow and that societal pressure from below grows, that gives an opportunity for those within the system to be able to make that move towards reform type behavior and see whether or not they're purged. One of the examples that I saw of this, a little bit of it happening, was when the regime decided to brutalize the ladies in white in early 2010. I mean, they were breaking bones, these women then were marching through the streets with casts. And then I saw people like Carlos Varela, I saw Silvio Rodriguez making some comments about the ladies in white, and that this was what was taking place wasn't acceptable. And these are people that have a direct relationship with the government, and other voices emerging. And I think that's something that very much unnerved the regime. It was probably one of the things that led them to view the Catholic Church as an option for them to negotiate how to release the remaining prisoners of the Black Cuban Spring.
Yes.
My name is Anita Pushki and I work at Christian Democratic International Center. In your opinion, has the regime won this diplomacy struggle? Because we see in last February they took the presidency of CELAC, which is the Latin American organization, which has in their statutes something like they defend human rights and democracy. And as Cuba having the presidency. And in Europe, the European Union is going to negotiate bilateral agreements. And now yesterday we find out that Belgium is going to start a cooperation project with a university in Santiago de Chile. So what is your impression? Have they won this international lobby campaign?
We're going to conclude this seminar in just a couple of minutes, so we have one last session from the guys.
Thank you. I had a question about how you think that the death of Chavez and the possible change in Venezuela will affect the Cuban economy. Maduro spoke on television yesterday about the problems that he actually sees with the Venezuelan economy. And he spoke about that he recognizes that there are a lot of US dollars in the country and that they will see if there will be a possibility to have a two currency economy. He also spoke about the Alba Fund, where he recognized how much money there actually are there, that we need to use that. We need to use this fund in order to try to recover our economy. And no knowing that Venezuela devaluated their currency at the beginning of this year, and probably there is another devaluation in a few months' time. How do you see this will affect Cuba and also other countries? I visited El Salvador a couple of weeks ago, and on all the national television stations, you have the commercial about the Alva food, the Alva medical, the Alva petroleum, and so on. Do you think this will continue with Maduro, or do you think there will be a change now when Chavez is there?
On the way there, the microphone. We are many people in here from different sectors. We are some in the parliament. There are the Christian Democratic International Center is Eva Gustafsson and her staff from the Young National Foundation. There are young school students. There are journalists. There are delegates from Romania, Spain, and others. What could we do as politicians, but also as individuals and in our roles, in order to support democratic development?
Well, I think dovetailing on what Elizabeth was talking about in this Bush meeting, not allowing the regime to get away with murder and holding them accountable, especially if there's systematic human rights violations. And the idea that the European common position be gutted and they started setting up bilateral relations at a time when the human rights situation in the country is deteriorating, that goes directly against the spirit of the EU common position. Secondly, there's a universal periodic review which all countries are subjected to. Cuba is undergoing that this year. They should be asking tough questions and see what their responses are going to be. To the issue what Eva was asking concerning Venezuela, I think Maduro's statements leading up to the election is perhaps to try to soften the perception that he's completely controlled by the Cubans. To what degree they're going to have to retrench in their international revolutionary project or their regional revolutionary project, I really don't see us getting a good idea of that until after the elections, when they no longer have to be so coy with the voters. My suspicions are that if they have to retrench and back off, the last country that they'll substantially reduce their assistance would be Cuba, since that's viewed as the revolutionary lodestone. However, countries like Nicaragua, Salvador, Ecuador, they may be in for a rough ride after living off the largesse of the Chavez regime. And finally, you're asking what can all of you do? I think visiting this website is one important step. Keeping informed. Visiting Amnesty International's urgent actions. Unfortunately, there are new prisoners of conscience. The only journalist in prison currently in the Western Hemisphere in the Americas is a Cuban, Calixto Ramon Martinez. There are also labor activists, Ulises González Moreno, who was sentenced to 2 years in prison for peligrosidad social predilectiva, a predilection to social dangerousness and what he may do in the future. He was given the option to start spying on his fellow labor organizers, which he turned down, and had his sentence ratified on December 20th of 2012. I think knowing these names, letting others know about it, raising it in Parliament, writing about it in op-ed pieces, is a crucial way of breaking that veil of impunity and silence, which unfortunately descended after the success of obtaining the release of all the prisoners of the Black Cuban Spring. So to be rather precise, right now the regime is in a better place, but they lost a tremendous battle when for one of the few times in its history they were forced, they were put up against the wall and they had to release people that they were going to have in prison for another 18 years as of yesterday. And they had to release them. And that was because of the international pressure and the internal pressure inside the island. And the question is how to reestablish those pressures and how to have a principled policy focused around human rights. It's not undermined by crass commercial interests. I leave it to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John. I think it's a great pleasure for all of us in here to actually be able to take part of your of your words and your opinions and views and your knowledge on this subject. And I thought this was very interesting, and I think it's good that we are all engaged in this issue. And just to quote a comment that I got on Facebook when I published a photo that from my Norwegian friend Christian Anna, we need more Yoani Sánchez in the world. And I think
we need more Christian angles as well.
And we need more human rights in general. Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you.